Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo wine info video where we review curious wines for curious minds. Now, over the last few videos, we've been following the Wine Mag Old Vine report, which is now in its second edition. Now, in the first edition, 8 out of the 10 wines on the podium were made from Chenin Blanc. And in the second edition, in 2025, 8 out of the 12 wines on the podium were Chenin Blanc. And this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise because not only does Chenin Blanc completely dominate the old vine plantings in South Africa, vines that are over 35 years of age, but Chenin Blanc also dominates South African viticulture in general. It is by far the most planted cultivar in the country. Now, it's interesting to note that Stellenbosch as a region had only 2 wines in the top 10 on the podium. And that is kind of strange considering that it has the lion's share of old vine plantings. It's got roughly 1,100 hectares of plantings, whereas Swartland has 900 hectares roughly, and then Paarl is third with 500 to 600. But it is also the country's most prestigious wine region. Now, in the 2025 edition, they had 33%, so it was slightly better, but there's still no one particular region that is dominating this award. And I guess it's probably worth saying that this is less about Stellenbosch underperforming and rather an indication that old vine culture in South Africa is spread rather broadly, and that there are a whole bunch of really talented viticulturalists and winemakers who are getting the hang of making incredible wines from these delicate old vine planting. In fact, editor of the report, Christian Eedes, noted that it was roughly 2/3 of the wines that entered the competition that scored 90 points or higher. And having judged with Christian myself on more than a few occasions, I can guarantee you he's not one of those wine critics who has suffered the fever of wine score inflation and hands out 90-point tags as though they were glow sticks at Burning Man. He really does make a wine work quite hard in order to earn that 90-point medal. And that's another reason why the Wine Mag reports really are essential reading for lovers of South African wine. Now, today's curious wine is an old vine wine that is also from Stellenbosch and is also a Chenin Blanc. And it comes from fruit that was planted in 1986, which means that when those vines were going into the ground, Tom Cruise was flipping the bird while flipping his bird in the first Top Gun film. Chernobyl was going through a wild nuclear meltdown, and children across America were going through a collective meltdown when they watched Transformers the movie. Spoiler alert, Optimus Prime dies. Since that time, we've had to sit through another Top Gun movie, multiple Transformer movies, and more than our fair share of political meltdowns. And all that time, those little vines were sitting quietly and calmly in Stellenbosch, doing their thing, vintage after vintage, slowly aging and maturing. And today, we get to taste the joy of their quiet but persistent labors. So the wine we're talking about is the Delheim Wild Ferment Chenin Blanc, which is an estate wine, which means it is made from fruit that is all from vines planted on Delheim estate, which sits in the really rather beautiful foothills of Sewensburg on the Stellenbosch side. And the wine is made by winemaker Noncebo Langa. Delheim is old, like 300 years old. And yet it's not an estate that really stands up and shouts about the fact that it is all senior and deserves extra respect. But really it should shout, or at least it should be talked about some more, because this is an estate that is an absolute historical juggernaut. So just to give you a tiny glimpse into how influential they've been, I'm going to list a few of the history-making events that they have been involved in. First of all, Delheim was one of the first estates in the world to envision what wine tourism should look like. Globally, many people look at the Napa wine region and talk about how it has absolutely mastered luxury wine tourism. And yet before any of that existed, Spat Sperling, the then owner of Delheim, along with Frans Milan from Simonsig and the team from Spear Estate, also in Stellenbosch, sat down and envisioned what would become the world's first formalized, structured wine tourist route. So today, what feels absolutely normal, cellar doors, wine tours, wine trams, cutesy little maps and tasting centers, that was all done for the first time in Stellenbosch. And Delheim was there at the start. Secondly, Delheim was the estate to bottle the world's very first estate Pinotage. Now, of course, there were some other bottlings from co-ops that had put Pinotage on the label, but Pinotage was still in its awkward adolescence in 1960, and yet while it was still trying to figure itself out, and while winemakers were still trying to figure it out, Delheim said, we've got it, we're happy to put our name on that label. That's not a historical footnote. That is tectonic. Then they followed it up in 1976 by being the first estate in the world to produce a Pinotage rosé. Now, this was long before rosé wine was cool anywhere, and it was certainly before Provence had kind of copyrighted its pale salmon pink as a global code for luxury. And finally, there are their Riesling vibes, which includes the fact that they currently have the oldest living vineyard of Riesling in South Africa, but also the fact that way back in the day, when Frans Malone, and Frans Malone is from Simonsig, which is a farm next to Delheim, Frans Malone is considered to be the father of Riesling in South Africa. And yet, it was Delheim that Frans Malone chose to sneak his grapes across the road onto the neighboring estate of Delheim to press them there, because he kind of felt like, as father of Riesling, and this was his favorite grape, he really didn't want to risk those grapes on his kind of rustic cellar equipment that he had. So he asked Spat Sperling if he could use his basket press. But this was in strict contravention of the KWV estate laws. You can't just take grapes from one estate and bottle it on another estate and then still think it's an estate wine. So Spats and France decided, well, we'll wait till it's dark. And so they did. And under the cover of night, they very sneakily began pressing their Riesling grapes in that famous basket press, until two KWV agents jumped out from behind the bushes and said, "Wat gaan hier aan, meneer?" And then they were both fined 50 Rand and threatened with jail time should it happen again. But thus was the Wild West in the Deep South. It was the Cape Winelands in the middle of the 20th century. So whether it was wine tourism or Pinotage or rosé or Riesling, Delheim have been there at the start of all these fascinating chapters in South African history. So I hope you can see, as a result of all my historical musings, that the wild ferment Chenin we're drinking today is not just any old Chenin Blanc, but rather it's a wine that comes from an estate that has for decades been slightly ahead of the curve, progressive, solving problems, thinking differently, and driving the industry forward. But enough about the past. Let's drink. Now, when we give this guy a sniff, well, it's actually gloriously extroverted for an old vine wine, because they can often be so shy. But here you get this amazing burst of peach blossom. Then you get some really quite vivid, fresh cut apricots, that slightly tartar element. And then there's this beautiful kind of what seems like it will be sweet and sour elements of lime zest, but also roasted pineapple. It's really a very dynamic nose. And here's the thing, there's no Franken yeast, no thiol boosting crazy yeast product here that can take the precursors and turn them into 10 times the aromatic intensity. This is wild ferment, which means it's the yeasts that just naturally occur on the grape skins and in the cellar. But there is one thing to note. Noncebo tells me that when she produced this wine, she did de-stem the grapes and then crush them. So you do have the fact that the skins have been broken and they're mushing around a little bit in the press, which means that you are going to release more of those precursors, those little building blocks that fermentation will eventually turn into aromatics. So that could perhaps in part explain why this wine is so extroverted. Then when we give it a sip, well, this whole wine feels on the palate kind of like shaped like an inverse funnel, because it starts beautifully broad and welcoming, this lovely soft kind of nectarine stone fruit and even peach and more of that apricot, but it's quite welcoming and inviting. But then something strange happens. You feel it start to tighten a little bit, and that stone fruit segues into some juicier, slightly more vibrant naartjie elements, which is like a mandarin. By the way, you need to take a look at the Chenin Blanc Association's South African flavor wheel. It's basically flavor notes developed purely from a South African dialect. They've got one in Shona as well, and also in Xhosa. They include all sorts of crazy South African tasting notes, naartjie being one of them, pop being another one. Anyway, take a look at that. It's really interesting. They've done an amazing job of trying to show how the language you speak and the culture we have actually shapes what kind of flavor notes we bring up in wine, because someone who is Shona and lived in Zimbabwe all their life is unlikely to wax lyrical about English elderflower. But anyway, back to the wine. It was busy tightening on my palate and going from stone fruit to naartjie, which is beautiful, but then it tightens even further and becomes this really sort of pristine dash of lime juice right at the finish. And it's not just sour lime juice, it's got this snap, beautiful little grapefruit bitter snap on the finish in the best way possible. I need another sip. It really is beautiful the way it starts broad and tightens in. I'm going to repeat myself, but it's just superb. Now, after first tasting this wine, I still couldn't quite get my head around how it was so aromatically expressive on vines that were planted in 1986. And so I got hold of winemaker Noncebo Langa and I said to her, please, just tell me a little bit about what's going on here. What did you do in the cellar? What were the tricks? How did you get a wine that is traditionally fairly reserved in its old vine form to be so expressive? How did you get it to share more of itself with you? Here's what she had to say about the winemaking.
Forget the volatile aromas. I think it leads to the question about enzymes. We do use enzymes. Although this is a wild ferment, there's still a level of control. There is wild ferments within reason. There's a lot of stress when it comes to allowing the juice to ferment willy-nilly. So we still use enzymes as the grapes are being crushed and destemmed. And then obviously the enzymes are optimized to not only release juice, but to also release the precursors in the skins. With concrete, we get a lot more fresher aromatics. So the fruits are more primary. Acidity also is more pronounced when it's in the egg versus the barrel, where the barrel matures quite a bit and then it mellows out and becomes creamier. So then you start getting more of your secondary aromas from the barrel. So both those components, and you put them together, they just give something amazing. We are so fortunate that we haven't needed to add acid with our white wine. They come in super high acid, like 7.8. It's quite exciting, actually. It's quite a nice phenomenon. What I love about it is that you're always going to get something different depending on the vintage. You will never have it exactly the same. There'll be markers to say, okay, it comes from Stellenbosch, it comes from this area, but then it will never be exactly the same. You've got different natural yeast, you've got different conditions in the climates, the growing conditions are different. So all of those influences play a role in how dissimilar the vintages or the wines are. So for me, this is the excitement. Is like you're never going to get the same with any vintage.
Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but I'm going to leave you links to 2 videos, both of which are about wines made by estates in these same foothills on the Stellenbosch side of the Simonsberg, which is not only beautiful, as I've said, but also so history rich. And these videos are from estates that have changed the South African wine industry for the better. So watch those and make sure you subscribe to the HanDrink Solo YouTube channel. Until next time, stay curious and always drink niche.